It's a theme park tragedy. It happened overnight.
23-year-old Colin Scott was dissolved by the boiling acidic water.
July 1st, 1916, Charles Van Sant been killed by a shark.
Can you take us back to what you actually witnessed at the party?
Silicone had taken Dawn into, and it was very chaotic.
It's October 27th of 2020, and what seemed like a typical Tuesday at work unfolds at the Lake Oliver Dam, located near the fall line of the Chattahoochee River, right in the middle of Columbus, Georgia. Two seasoned professionals, Alex Reed Paxton and Eric Herbert, have made their way to the dam site to carry out some routine checks. They're employed by Glenn Industrial Group, a company specializing in contracts for underwater maintenance systems. According to the initial rundown of their task, Eric and Alex were informed that one of the operating chains on a specific floodgate was malfunctioning, most likely because it snapped. The two were supposed to dive deep and pinpoint where exactly the situation had gone wrong so that a proper plan could be made for the necessary repairs. This was a very usual task, but given the nature of their jobs, there were inherent risks involved as well. One of the biggest risks to consider was the differential water pressure. To grasp this phenomenon in the context of dams, imagine having two colossal water tanks, each as big as a swimming pool connected by a really narrow pipe. One tank is filled to the brim, while the other remains empty. When you open the valve between them, a relentless torrent of water surges through the pipe from the full tank to the empty one. When this water flows, the pressure in the full tank plunges to extremely negative levels as it drains out. Meanwhile, the empty tank's pressure skyrockets rapidly as it fills. This stark contrast between pressure in the two tanks is known as differential pressure, or delta P. On top of that, the sheer force of the water being blasted through the narrow pipe is also incredibly powerful because it's being squeezed from a vast expanse into a tiny opening, then back out again into the open space. So the intense concentration of force acts like a monstrous vacuum cleaner, pulling anything unfortunate enough to get in its way with a terrifying suction mechanism. So to steer clear of calamity before sending divers inside the dam, it's made sure that no switches are left open inside. And for that, the most crucial pre-dive effort is to identify all the points on these valves where potential pressure differences could be present. The points are then labeled with a tag so that no one lays a finger on them until the tag is taken off after the repairs. Then comes the paperwork. All the tagged points are also added to a checklist, which is then given the green light by supervising dam employees and then by the officials of the repairing company. This whole process is known as the lockout-tagout process, or LOTO. On the fateful day of October 27th of 2020, the LOTO procedures were wrapped up by the Lake Oliver Dam employees, and a total of 4 points were listed and double-checked after being tagged out for maintenance. 3 of them were the main gates, while the 4th one was something called the penstock priming valve. This valve, connected to an even smaller pipe, was used to prime the penstock before the main gate swung open. If the penstock were to be completely empty when the gate is opened, a massive surge of water would forcefully enter the chamber, potentially causing damage to the turbine located at the end. So, to avoid the water from rushing in too quickly, this little priming pipe allows a smaller amount of water to enter the penstock and fill it up before the dam starts working at full throttle. While the LOTO checklist concluded detailing only 3 head gates and 1 priming valve, what the dam employees completely overlooked was another crucial priming valve that remains unaccounted for, neither closed nor tagged. Meanwhile, Alex and Eric, convinced that all pre-dive protocols had been meticulously followed, geared up for their final task ahead. However, prior to entering the dam, they conducted their own final check, scanning for any signs of differential pressures as per the LOTO checklist. But as anticipated, they found no sign of the missing point, as it wasn't even listed. After dropping their meters into the water and confirming stability at the 4 tagged locations, they felt confident in their assessment. So, positioned above Gate 3, they prepared themselves mentally for their next steps into the dam. Upon declaring who would enter the dam first and who would oversee from above, Alex stepped forward, volunteering to dive, leaving Eric to supervise from outside. However, what Alex couldn't have imagined in that moment was that his decision to volunteer would lead him down a path filled with unforeseen and ominous events. He dismissed Eric and dove in to investigate the situation. What adds a chilling layer to this story was that Alex was equipped with a helmet camera and a light setup, intending to document his findings for the company's records, unaware that this very camera would capture his final, unsettling moments just a short while later. Descending further into the depths, the footage from Alex's GoPro initially captures routine instructions from Eric through their communication gear, with Alex responding and affirming directions. As he continued deeper, he surpassed the 20-foot mark. Everything appeared normal, just as expected, until it suddenly wasn't. Seconds later, the camera captured violent bubbles and deafening noise in the vicinity for what felt like an eternity. Alex's hysterical screams pierced the video, reaching Eric on the other side of the line. Desperate to understand what had happened, Eric shouted Alex's name. Through the turbulent noise, Alex only managed to convey, "I'm stuck." However, the cacophony drowned out his words, and Eric had to ask again. Alex repeated himself, revealing his dire situation.
I'm gonna have him keep small, just hold your spot. Roger.
In that moment of confusion and panic, neither Eric nor the dam crew, nor Alex himself, comprehended the full extent of the horror unfolding. It was only when Eric and the team outside the dam attempted to pull Alex to safety using a tether that the chilling truth began to show. Unbeknownst to Alex, he'd inadvertently approached the open, unchecked priming valve. The valve's suction created an unforgiving vortex that ensnared him in a matter of seconds, but the pipe's narrow 10-inch opening only allowed his left arm to be drawn in, while the rest of his body was mercilessly pinned against the unyielding dam wall. The crushing force exerted, estimated at a staggering 850 pounds per square inch, imposed a pressure equal to the combined weight of 14 adult African elephants, pressing down on his chest. His bones buckled under the relentless strain, rendering him unable to expand his chest cavity to draw in air. Within these brief and agonizing moments, the mechanical asphyxia induced by the severe compression and his inability to breathe sealed his fate. Outside the dam, Eric and the crew frantically scrambled to manage the escalating pressure and find the opened valve. However, despite their desperate efforts, it took them a nerve-wracking 30 minutes to find and finally reach the valve they needed to close. To make matters even worse, the valve was hidden behind a locked door. By then, it was tragically too late. All they could recover from the depths of the dam was Alex's lifeless body and the camera that had captured his futile screams for help, marking a solemn end to a very preventable tragedy. Between Norway and the North Pole exists a gathering of small islands known as Svalbard. It's mainly just ice and barren rock, and just over 2,500 people live there. However, living alongside them are as many as 3,000 polar bears. Polar bears are very dangerous animals, and unfortunately in Svalbard, confrontations arise with tragic outcomes for both people and these bears. Almost every year, polar bears are shot due to encounters with people, and over recent decades, human lives have been lost and numerous people have been injured. This is the story of the 2011 British School Exploring Society expedition that resulted in tragedy. Earlier in the year 2000, the Svalbard governor issued a warning after several polar bears were seen nearby highly populated settlements. According to one Longyearbyen resident, a man sleeping in a cabin near the shore was attacked a few years ago by a bear which smashed its way in and grabbed his sleeping bag. Fortunately, he managed to fight the animal off with an axe. One airport worker who lives near the area said there have been a number of bear attacks in recent years. The problem is, when the ice melts, the bears lose their way and can't catch food. Most people don't really know how dangerous they are. There was even a day when one came down to the sea and people were running down to take pictures. They had no idea their lives could be in danger. Dwindling sea ice in recent years has led the bears, which usually hunt seals, to look inland for food. To prevent any tragedies, visitors are told clearly as they arrive, if you move into bear territory, you must have a loaded rifle and someone who knows how to use it. Arriving in Svalbard on July 23rd, a party of 80 teenagers and adult guides planned on spending over a month exploring the area. Amongst them was a 17-year-old Horatio Chappell. He was a student at Eton College and was hoping to become a doctor. Midway through the trip, Chappell hiked to the Von Post Glacier alongside a 13-person group with 10 other students and 2 instructors. The group camped overnight on a snow bridge close to the glacier, known for frequent sightings of polar bears. In the early hours of August 5th, a large but also starved-looking male polar bear approached the camp. The bear entered the camp around 7:30 a.m. and avoided all traps and safety guidelines the group followed to prevent bears from entering. The string of tripwires designed to trigger alarms and flares failed to activate. While nobody knows for sure, the most likely reason for this was that the bear knocked over a surrounding post, dislodging the cartridge that would have triggered the mines. At around 7:30 a.m., Chappell had just emerged from his tent and was in the process of standing up when he was attacked by the massive polar bear. After overpowering and batting the teenager to the ground, the bear mauled him around the head, face, and neck, killing him. It continued its attack, badly injuring 2 of his tent mates. One of the teenagers who survived was Patrick Flinders, who left with horrific facial injuries. He remembers that night very clearly. While he was sleeping, he heard scratching outside his tent before it suddenly collapsed. The fabric of the tent hit Patrick's face, and he looked up and saw a huge mouth snapping. There was blood all around the bear's nose. At that moment, he thought he was going to die. It hit Patrick with its paw, and then he felt its teeth clamp his elbow, biting down on the bone. Suddenly, it had his head in its jaws, and he could hear it crunching his skull. He said, "I could hear it crack, and then I heard a growl which was deafening because I was so up close." Patrick Flinders was left with fragments of the bear's teeth lodged in his head, and later needed 20 stitches. Flinders said he lashed out and tried to punch the bear before the attack came to an end, at which point the bear let go and chased down another group member. At that time, warning shouts woke instructor Michael Reed, who was in possession of the group's only rifle. He later described taking careful aim at the bear to prevent hitting any of the young explorers, only for the weapon to misfire. Despite multiple attempts to chamber a round, the rifle still failed to fire. While struggling with the gun, he shouted to another member of the group to fire pen flares in an attempt to scare off the attacker. The bear then turned its attention to Reed, knocking him off his feet and biting his head. He unsuccessfully attempted to gouge at the bear's eyes, but was saved when the animal was distracted by a group leader, Andrew Ruck, throwing rocks at it. It moved towards Ruck and attacked him, leaving him badly mauled. In the time the bear was distracted, Reed was able to reload the rifle and shoot the animal until it died. An inquest into Chappell's death found that the group had opted for tripwire flares rather than an overnight watch or guard dogs, a decision which resulted in them being caught by surprise during the attack after the trips failed to fire. While it was ruled that the attack would have been prevented if the group had stayed in cabins rather than tents, there was no legal requirement for that step at the time. The group was also found to be missing items of equipment, including parts of the tripwire alert system. While Chappell was killed before Reed attempted to shoot the bear, the quality of the rifle they carried and the lack of training the instructors had received likely contributed to later injuries. It was found that training with the weapon was limited to just 4 shots per team member and basic instruction on handling. This lack of training meant that the instructors were unfamiliar with its safety operation, which prevented the loading of the rifle when the safety was engaged. Instead, rounds were ejected, matching Reed's later description of the incident. Police later disclosed that the organizers of the expedition had not assigned a night watchman because of dense fog on the night of the incident, and that during the emergency, their gun failed to fire 4 times because its safety catch was engaged. The injured men were trip leaders Michael Reed, who was 29, and 27-year-old Andrew Ruck. Also, two trip members, 17-year-old Patrick Flinders and 16-year-old Scott Bendel Smith, were badly mauled as well. A horrifying video of the last moments of an award-winning photographer has gone viral online over a decade after his untimely death. You may have seen a viral video which first circulated on YouTube in 2013 of a man wearing a horse head prop while being dragged around by a whirlpool, but you may not know what happened just moments later. Acclaimed photographer Jacob Cockle was just 28 when the video was shot in a bid to make a sensational piece of footage online. Having won awards for his sea photography from the likes of National Geographic and the Sunday Times, Cockle was known for capturing the best shots possible by using increasingly dangerous tactics. Described by those who knew him, he was a daredevil who was obsessed with the ocean. Cockle found his calling in the water and taking pictures of surfers, boats, and whirlpools. Merely a few times a year, a vortex in Hale Harbor located in Cornwall would appear. To stop the harbor silting up, the Victorians engineered an area where water would be stored in a pool at high tide, and once the tide had retreated, it would be released back into the harbor to wash away the sand. Beneath the quay was a tunnel through which the pool of water would run into, but sometimes the tide would come back in faster than the water could pass through the tunnel. Thus, the whirlpool was created. Jacob's adventurous spirit and the appeal of the swift swirling vortex made him eager to record this event. His plan was to film the action as he swam in the whirlpool despite all the warning signs. The vortex began on May 28th of 2013. With his camera in his hand and already in his wetsuit, Jacob was excited at the prospect of filming the whirlpool once again. His friend David agreed to film him as he swam around the whirlpool. By the time David reached the harbor, Jacob was already in the water. He was wearing a rubber horse's head, a prop he thought would make the video more eye-catching on YouTube. Jacob wanted to make the most of it whilst the whirlpool was still there, despite having shot a lot of footage of this specific vortex in the past. In the video, Jacob swirls around the whirlpool's edge as David films from the quay. You can hear David mention how powerful it looks. Letting the water carry him around again, it tugged Jacob down as it caught him. This was a constant cycle of circling in and out of the whirlpool to get extra footage. After a few minutes, he asked David to pass him a GoPro camera attached to a short pole, as Jacob wanted to get one last shot below the surface. Jacob dove down as David watched, but Jacob didn't reappear.
One last bit underwater first. On the day.
Calling his friend's name, David began to worry. He ran across to the other end of the quay where the tunnel of the whirlpool funneled into a flow pool, but there was no sign of Jacob. He then asked a nearby fisherman if he had seen anyone come through, but he hadn't. There was no sign of Jacob as water was churning through the tunnel below. David ran back and forth, and then he saw him. The tunnel had spat Jacob out, and he was in the pool lying face down whilst floating in the water. David swam out to him, but it was too late. Jacob unfortunately drowned after being sucked into the whirlpool. He was a very talented photographer and surfer. All who met him stated he was one of the nicest, friendliest watermen you could meet, and was loved by many. During the summer of 1916, a deadly heat wave has struck the entire East Coast, making temperatures skyrocket. This, along with the terrible polio epidemic in the United States, has driven thousands of people to the seaside resorts of the New Jersey shore. Stretching 141 miles along the Atlantic, this strip had it all, from beaches to boardwalks packed with water parks and amusement parks. However, among them all, ocean swimming was the most popular. Until this time, swimming in the ocean wasn't exactly as popular as a recreational activity, but this particular summer drove thousands of tourists to the New Jersey shores. Little did anyone know that the next set of days were about to bring events so disturbing that they would turn the idea of venturing into the ocean into a worldwide fear. On Saturday, July 1st, 1916, 24-year-old Charles Epting Vincent was kicking back at the Ingleside Hotel in Beach Haven with his family. His father, Dr. Eugene LaRue Vincent, was a well-known nose and throat specialist, while Charles was trying to make his mark in business. The weekend was rolling smoothly, and Charles and his crew were having a blast on the beach, soaking up the sun before they had to head in for dinner at 6 p.m. With a bit of time to kill, Charles figured he could take a quick dip in the Atlantic before the evening would set in. Being there on the beach all day, Charles had ended up making buddies with a Chesapeake Bay retriever, so when he decided to hit the waves, the dog followed him. Just minutes into paddling, Charles noticed something was off with the dog. At first he assumed that perhaps the animal was struggling to keep up with his pace, but then he saw it turning back, swimming frantically towards the shore, abandoning him. As he continued to paddle and try to figure out the dog's freak out, a sudden icy jolt hit his left leg beneath the surface, and before he could even stabilize himself, he realized it wasn't just a jolt. Something had clamped down on his thigh and wasn't letting it go. His screams tore through the air and didn't stop before he finally grasped that it was actually a shark sinking its teeth into his flesh. Back on the shore, several bystanders, including Vincent's family, were blissfully ignorant of the horror unfolding just yards away. Among them was Alexander Ott, a champion swimmer and the member of the American Olympic team. He was there serving as a coast guard, but like everyone else, had no clue about the nightmare happening in the water. Suddenly, Charles' gut-wrenching screams were heard through the air, but the Coast Guard and beachgoers still thought that he was just calling his dog. Soon enough, it became apparent that something was terribly wrong when they saw Charles being pulled in the water. Alexander Ott and another bystander, Sheridan Taylor, plunged into the water, joining Charles' frantic struggle against the creature they had no idea of. In a desperate, bloody attempt, they managed to yank Charles out of harm's way, but not without taking a serious hit. Part of his thigh had been ripped to shreds. Alexander and Sheridan hightailed it back to the shore with Charles. Once they reached the Ingleside Hotel, they sought any available help, but it was too late. Charles' artery had been severed and he was bleeding out rapidly. Before aid could arrive, he died laying helplessly on the hotel manager's desk. At this point, nobody had a clue what attacked Charles. Some said they saw a fin slicing through the water before the attack, while others speculated it could be a giant sea turtle, known for its viciousness towards humans beneath the waves. In the following days, sea captains docking in Newark and New York City reported several shark sightings off the coast. But back then, the idea of a shark attacking a person was so unheard of that these warnings were brushed aside. On top of that, all of the Jersey Shore beaches stayed open without any strong warnings. This was a fatal mistake. Just 5 days after the first attack on July 6th of 1916, 45 miles north of Beach Haven in Spring Lake, disaster struck again, this time even worse. Charles Bruder, a 27-year-old Swiss bell captain at the Essex and Sussex Hotel, embarked on what seemed to be a routine swim 130 yards from shore. He had no idea the tranquil waters were about to become his worst nightmare. Just like Charles, as Bruder swam, he suddenly felt gripped by a crushing force that tore into his abdomen and legs, and before he could process what was happening, he saw the water around him turn a dark, chilling red, with his own blood staining the sea. Doing what he could, he let out a scream at the top of his lungs, desperately calling for help. His hysteric cries reached a woman nearby, to whom the scene was so unbelievable that she thought it was a capsized canoe with its red hull floating eerily on the surface. Desperate and confused, she alerted two lifeguards, Chris Anderson and George White, who immediately rowed out in a lifeboat to what they believed was a simple rescue mission. However, it was only upon reaching Bruder that they were struck with the horrifying reality, seeing a young man who had been savagely attacked by a beast that had bitten his legs off. However, unlike the earlier case, there was no doubt now. A shark, possibly a man-eater, was the predator. They hauled his mutilated body from the water in a desperate attempt to save him, but despite their efforts, the blood loss was too great, and Bruder tragically succumbed to his injuries before they could make it back to shore. The aftermath was a scene of even more chaos and despair. When the lifeguards reached the shore, the sight of Bruder's mutilated, lifeless body was so horrifying that some of the women on the beach fainted from shock. Following this disturbing event, the media went into overdrive, blowing up the shark threat in New Jersey shores. Shark sightings surged, reported daily from all over the area. Fear gripped the community so tightly that some people made false reports, adding to the chaos. To calm the situation down, on July 8th, a panel of 3 experts held a press conference at the American Museum of Natural History. They assured the public that while the first 2 incidents were extremely rare shark behavior, there was no chance of another attack. Though it was actually rare shark behavior, the latter part of their statement was again a disastrous misjudgment. Adding to it, the economic toll was already severe, and resorts had to remain open at full capacity without any strict enforcement against swimming in the ocean. Almost 30 miles north of Spring Lake, the town of Matawan was completely at peace until now. The news of shark attacks had reached them. The locals felt safe, as the area's location being a creek made it very unlikely for interactions between sharks and humans. However, Thomas Cortell, a seasoned sea captain from the area, had seen the unimaginable. One day, he saw an 8-foot shark lurking under a bridge in the creek. He rushed to warn the townspeople, but they dismissed his fears, attributing them to his old age. So just like the victims before them, the people of Matawan underestimated the threat at hand, and would ultimately cost them. 6 days after the second attack on July 12th, around 2 p.m., a group of local boys, including 11-year-old Lester Stillwell, were swimming in the creek. One of the boys had brought along his pet dog, which swam alongside them. As they splashed and played, they ventured into a more open part of the water near an area known as Wyckoff Dock. There, they noticed what seemed to be an old, black, weather-beaten board or a weathered log. Driven by curiosity, they couldn't resist getting a closer look, but out of the blue, a dorsal fin cut through the water. Before they could wrap their heads around it, Stillwell's scream broke the silence like a glass shattering. He was pulled into a whirlwind of thrashing limbs and chaotic splashes. The shark, with a taste for humans, had taken hold of him, and in the blink of an eye, it pulled the defenseless boy down into the depths. The group quickly realized this might be the very shark they'd been hearing about for weeks. In a state of sheer panic, they fled the water and raced down to the town for help. Among the responders was Watson Stanley Fisher, a courageous 24-year-old local businessman who came to see the scene for himself. Fisher and others plunged into the creek in a desperate search for Stillwell, but it soon became clear that finding him alive wouldn't be possible. But they were determined to at least recover his body to bring some closure to the grieving family, and they continued their search. After a grueling search for Stillwell, Fisher finally found the boy's extremely mutilated body. He hauled it up and started heading back to shore. But the man-eater, drawn by the scent of blood, sensed another opportunity. In full view of the horrified townspeople, the shark seized Fisher and tore him apart. The savage assault separated Fisher from Stillwell's body, which was then carried away, drifting upstream. Fisher was rushed to the hospital, but with his right thigh severely mangled and blood pouring from his wounds, he succumbed to his injuries at Monmouth Memorial Hospital at 5:30 p.m. the same day. The search for Stillwell's body continued, eventually recovering it 150 feet upstream from the Wyckoff Dock 2 days later. Meanwhile, in Matawan, the terror wasn't over. Just 30 minutes after the brutal attacks on Stillwell and Fisher, around half a mile from the Wyckoff Dock, 14-year-old Joseph Dunn, his brother Michael Dunn, and their friend Jerry Horahan plunged into the river for a late afternoon swim, without a care in the world, completely oblivious to the recent horrors. As they played, a motorboat approached from the keyport, and the man on board shouted urgently for the boys to get out of the water. Michael and Jerry, closest to the shore, scrambled out immediately, but Joseph was still a bit away and was leaping swiftly towards the shore to reach the other two. But before he could do that, the man-eating shark had already entered those waters. The massive creature breached its immense body half out of the water and clamped down on Joseph's leg. Panicking, Michael dove back into the water, frantically trying to fend off the shark. Meanwhile, the man in the motorboat also jumped in and tried to help. He was Thomas Cortell, the very same sea captain who had warned the townspeople about the shark's danger, but was given the cold shoulder. When he got wind of the attacks on Stillwell and Fisher, he rushed to the incident site to join the shark hunt, but ended up stumbling upon another victim on the way. Michael and Thomas finally managed to remove the shark's jaws from Joseph's mangled leg, which had been torn open from knee to ankle. However, luckily he was promptly attended to by the paramedics and ended up being the sole survivor of the shark's assault. Following the second attack, several fishermen claimed to have found the man-eater, but none of these reports were confirmed until 2 days after the last attack. That's when Michael Schleiser, a taxidermist and lion tamer from a circus, landed a 325-pound shark in Raritan Bay, just a few miles north of the mouth of Matawan Creek. The shark attacked him as well and nearly sank his boat before he managed to kill it using a shattered oar. When he finally cut open the beast, he found a disturbing mix of flesh and bones inside the stomach that filled about 2/3 of a milk crate and tipped the scales at 15 pounds. Later investigations confirmed that the shark was a young great white, and the remains inside were human. Authorities identified it as the same man-eater responsible for a horrifying 12-day spree of killing. The panel at the Museum of Natural History, which had previously dismissed the likelihood of a third attack, had to publicly admit that their views on sharks had drastically changed. Now they conceded that sharks could indeed be deadly to humans at times. The main effects of these attacks is how they ignited a media frenzy, blowing the danger out of proportion and growing the public fear and hate of sharks. The headlines portrayed all of sharks as bloodthirsty creatures in the public's eyes, leading to a wave of shark hunting that devastated their populations. This fear reached a new peak in 1974 when American author Peter Benchley released his novel, Jaws. The story of a rogue great white shark terrorizing the fictional town of Amity was likely inspired by the 1916 attacks. A year later, Steven Spielberg's adaptation of Jaws further drove the wrong point home, cementing the image of sharks as relentless killers worldwide. The film's success perpetuated a terror so intense that Peter Benchley later expressed regret over his creation, acknowledging the role it played in shaping the monstrous misconception around sharks. Despite the media's portrayal, shark attacks are extraordinarily rare, with the odds being about 1 in 11.5 million. Experts suggest these incidents are usually due to mistaken identity or the shark's confusion or curiosity, yet this doesn't lessen the tragedy of those who lost their lives.
The story of Timothy Treadwell, also known as the Grizzly Man, is a very disturbing and unfortunate event that involved a bear attack that took place at Katmai National Park. This park has about 3,000 of the total 35,000 Alaskan grizzly bears. As many know, grizzly bears or brown bears are extremely powerful creatures, growing up to lengths of 7 feet and weighing up to 700 pounds. But Timothy felt a connection to these bears getting way too close multiple times due to a delusional mutual respect. For 13 years, Timothy Treadwell camped in several Alaskan parks, but Katmai National Park was a favorite, crawling and walking up close to bears and filming them, often attempting to touch both cubs and adults. In the 85-year history of the park, no visitor had been killed by a grizzly. Firearms are prohibited within Katmai National Park. Bear spray is allowed, however, Tim had quit carrying bear spray for protection several summers ago. Treadwell often established his camp on or near established bear trails. During his last season, Tim had also hid and camouflaged his camp at the Grizzly Maze within the thick alder bush in an effort to hide from the Park Service. Unfortunately, this is where it took a turn for the worse.
Isn't it smart to be as strong as the bear?
In October 2003, Treadwell and his girlfriend, Amy Huguenard, visited Katmai National Park. According to Treadwell's diaries, Amy feared bears and felt very uncomfortable in their presence. Her final journal entries indicated that she wanted to be away from Katmai. Treadwell set his campsite near a salmon stream where wild bears commonly fed in autumn. He was in the park later in the year than normal, at a time when bears attempt to gain as much fat as possible for winter. Food was scarce that fall, causing the bears to be even more aggressive than usual. Timothy and Amy were to leave the park at his usual time of year, and had actually returned to Kodiak on September 26th to store their gear for the season and catch a connecting flight to return to their home in California. However, after an argument with the airline ticketer over the price of altering his return ticket, they both made the decision to return to their campsite on September 29th for an additional week. Treadwell also wanted to locate a favorite female brown bear that he was concerned about. He said he hated modern civilization and felt better in nature with the bears than he did with big cities around humans. The bear he had been used to during the summer had already gone into hibernation, and bears that Treadwell did not know so well from other parts of the park were moving in. Some of the last footage taken by Treadwell hours before his death includes video of a bear diving into the river repeatedly for a piece of dead salmon. Treadwell mentioned in the footage that he did not feel entirely comfortable around that particular bear, and in the documentary Grizzly Man, it speculated on whether Treadwell filmed the very bear that killed him. Around noon on Sunday, October 5th, 2003, Treadwell spoke with an associate in Malibu, California by satellite phone. He mentioned no problems with any bears. The next day, as scheduled at 2 p.m. on Monday, October 6th, air taxi pilot Willie Fulton from Andrew Airways arrives at Kaflia Lake to transport Tim and Amy out of the area for the year, but is approached by a large brown bear. Willie states it was rainy and foggy out that morning. After landing, Willie believes that he sees Tim shaking out the tarp and yells for the couple, but receives no response. He decides to hike up the path from the beach and through the thick alder bush towards the camp after he notices a little bit of movement. When he's about 3/4 of the way up the hill, he senses that something just didn't feel right. Something seems strange. Willie then states that he turned around and headed back down the path through the thick brush, and just as he gets to the plain, he turns around and spots a pretty nasty looking bear, a bear that he had seen on earlier flights. It was sneaking slowly down the trail with its head down. Willie then takes off and flies over the campsite 15 to 20 times in an attempt to chase the bear away, and sees what appears to be the same bear feeding from a human rib cage. But each time he flies over the camp, the bear decides to feed even faster. He then decides to connect with 4 other park rangers, including Ranger Ellis, to investigate what had happened. After exiting the plane, the 4 begin slowly hiking up the path from the lake, yelling as they walk to help locate any surviving victims and to alert any nearby bears of their presence. The visibility was poor with a heavy growth of bushes and tall grass. The camp was located on top of a ridge and out of sight. One ranger turned and saw an adult bear moving towards the group about 20 feet away. All 4 began yelling in hopes that the bear would see them and move away. Ranger Ellis, armed with a handgun, began to fire at the same time as the other rangers, who were each armed with shotguns. They were able to drop the bear 12 feet away. As they moved closer to the campsite, human remains were then found buried. 2 tents were discovered, one for gear and the main one used for sleeping. Both were collapsed and torn. However, there was no evidence that the bear had pulled the victims from the main tent. In front of this main tent was a large mound of mud, grass, and sticks. After moving a clump of dirt, Ranger Ellis later recalled seeing fingers and an arm protruding from the pile. In the 85-year history of Katmai National Park, this was the first known incident of a person being killed by a bear. A video camera recovered at the site proved to have been operating during the attack, but police said that the 6-minute tape contained only voices and cries, as bear number 141 mauled Treadwell to death. The video was later analyzed by Alaskan state troopers. The first sounds from the tape are from Amy. She sounds surprised and asks if it's still out there. Apparently, either Tim had asked Amy to turn on the camera, or Amy just turned it on out of reflex. The point being, the attack was in progress when the camera was turned on. The next voice is from Timothy as he screams to get out of here. The sound of a tent zipper is then heard and the tent flap opening. Amy is heard screaming over the background sounds of rain hitting the tent, the wind, and other storm sounds, all mixed in with the bear and Tim fighting to play dead. Not surprisingly, with Amy yelling and screaming nearby, this seems to work and the bear backs off. A short conversation occurs between Amy and Tim as they try to determine if the bear is really gone. Being trained as a physician's assistant, it's believed that Amy made her way to Tim, and from the sounds caught on tape, the bear returns and Amy is forced to back off. Tim then is clearly heard screaming that playing dead isn't working and begs her to hit the bear. The sound of the rain hitting the tent along with the wind muffle the sounds at this point. However, Amy is clearly heard yelling to fight back. She is then heard screaming, "Stop, go away," as the sound of a frying pan is used to beat the top of the bear's head, and the sound of Tim moaning. It's believed that at this point in the attack, the bear let go of Tim's head and grabbed him somewhere in the upper leg area. The sound of Amy screaming very loudly as Tim is clearly heard over the sounds of the storm saying, "Amy, get away, go away." Tim knew he was going to die at this point and wanted to save Amy from the same fate. The audio portion of this videotape lasts roughly 6 minutes. During this period, Tim's cries and pleading can be heard for 2/3 of that time. He didn't die quickly, unlike some traumatic death victims who were lucky enough to drift off to a shock-induced dream state. Tim was obviously very aware and struggling desperately to survive during the last moments of his life. Unlike what is portrayed in the movies, the bear is nearly silent. Only low growls and periodic grunts are heard, which adds to the horror of the scene. Sounds of the bear dragging Tim off and the fading sounds of the screams indicate that Tim is being pulled and dragged into the bush and away from the camp. As the tape comes to an end, the sounds of Amy's high-pitched screams rise to a new level, much like what has been described as the sound of a predator call used by hunters to produce the distressed cries of a small wounded animal, which often attracts bears. Biologist Larry Van Dale for the Alaskan Department of Fish and Game theorizes that Amy's screams may have prompted the bear to return and kill her. On Friday, October 8, 2003, 2 days after the investigators first arrived, a necroscopy of the larger bear, or Bear 141, was conducted at the scene by biologist Larry Van Dale, where it was learned that the stomach and digestive tract contained human remains and torn pieces of clothing. This event is a very tragic and unfortunate one that could have been avoided, but nonetheless is one of the most disturbing stories anyone has ever heard.
Steve Irwin had a love for all creatures, and his knack for being able to handle them so skillfully soon translated into a full-time career. In 1991, he started managing Birwa Reptile and Fauna Park, which his parents had run since 1970, and eventually changed the name to the Australia Zoo. His larger-than-life enthusiastic personality also paved the way to global television fame, most notably in the TV documentary series The Crocodile Hunter from 1997 to 2004. By July 2006, Irwin was on top of the world. He was married to American Terry Irwin and dad to daughter Bindi and son Robert. Plus, he and Terry had just plotted out a 10-year plan for the Australia Zoo, so when he took off to film a documentary in Queensland's Bott Reef, it just seemed like another adventure. He was already hosted in the 2001 special called The 10 Deadliest Snakes in the World, so the fact that this one was called the ocean's deadliest didn't faze him one bit. After all, he was committed to spreading the word about compassion for all creatures. Unfortunately, this trip didn't go as planned, and resulted in tragedy. The only animal Steve Irwin was afraid of was the parrot, due to numerous incidents where they bit him. However, the animal that actually took his life had a far more docile reputation. Stingrays are usually quite harmless, but on September 4th of 2006, a rare incident involving one caused Irwin's death at the age of 44. Cameraman Justin Lyons was one of Irwin's closest friends. They had worked together for 15 years, and Irwin considered him his best mate and right-hand man. He also knew how excited Irwin was to work on this particular documentary, where they would come face to face with the ocean's deadliest creatures. All the things that would normally make people scared is what Steve loved to do, so he was very excited about this documentary. They were about 8 days into the shoot and were on the search for tiger sharks but hit a patch of bad weather. So the two decided to fill their ruined day, and they jumped into an inflatable boat and went to look for something to do. It didn't take long for them to find a gigantic 8-foot wide stingray that would be perfect footage for another project they had in the future. Like they had many times before, they had a plan and got ready to shoot in the chest-deep waters. Stingrays are normally very calm. If they don't want you around them, they'll swim away, and in the water, filming was going very well. So they figured to do one last shot. The stingray was between the two of them, and Irwin would swim away towards the camera, and Lyons would film the ray swimming. But things didn't go as planned. All of a sudden, it propped on its front and started stabbing wildly with its tail, with rapid strikes in seconds. Lyons remembers noting that the powerful animals had been around for 60 million years. It probably thought Steve's shadow was a tiger shark, so it started to attack him. Even under those circumstances, Lyons focused on his work. They had a rule that if Steve was ever hurt or injured, they had to keep filming no matter what. It wasn't until Lyons turned back that he realized the tail strikes had gone straight into Irwin. Steve was standing in a huge pool of blood, and Lyons realized something had gone terribly wrong. The first priority was to get out of the water since the blood would surely attract sharks. They managed to get Irwin back onto the inflatable boat, with one crew member keeping his hand over the wound, and Lyons reminding Irwin to think of his kids, as he calmly looked up and said, "I'm dying." And that was the last thing he said. When they got back to the main boat called Croc 1, Lyons started CPR on him. But when they finally got him to medics, the prognosis was clear, and they pronounced him dead within 10 seconds of looking at him. After the tragedy, critics came out and said Irwin must have been behaving irresponsibly for something to go so wrong, But toxicologist Jamie Seymour was also on board Croc 1 that day, and says simply that was not true. Even though they were there to look for tiger sharks, Seymour and Irwin had specifically talked about the potential damage that a stinger's tail could do as well. News of Steve Irwin's death spread quickly on the afternoon of September 4th of 2006, prompting sad and shocked reactions from many Australians. The media was filled with Irwin talk, from tributes to discussion of his ambitious conservation plans and sympathy towards his family. The public was also quick to react to the tragic news, showing what a national icon Irwin had become in Australia. The relatively mundane animal that had killed the man who had survived some of the most dangerous beasts on the planet prompted disbelief. People were seen with black armbands and Irwin-themed mementos that ranged from wigs and fake crocodiles to replicas of his famed khaki uniform. At Disneyland, a major ride called Carousel of Progress was redesigned to become a new attraction called America Sings on June 28, 1974. It was an automated musical extravaganza that paid tribute to the musical history of America. The ride featured 6 stages in the central nucleus of the building. These 6 theaters rotated around in sequence, so it allowed the theater audience to experience each popular performance in sequence. The performance consisted of a 24-minute show featuring 4 big musical acts with a medley of period tunes sung by animated animals. During such a show, it was the job of the Disney hostess to stand on the left-hand side of each stage and greet the audience at the start of each show, as well as to bid them farewell at the end. The only glitch was that in the previous ride, Carousel of Progress, the theaters moved around the nucleus in a clockwise direction. This meant that the walls on the left-hand side of the stage moved away from each other. But in America Sings, the rotation was reversed, which meant that the walls moved towards each other on the left-hand side of the stage and closed in place to separate each theater from the other. Unfortunately, only 9 days after America Sings opened, tragedy struck. On the fateful night of July 8, 1974, Debbie Stone had an evening shift at America Sings. She was an 18-year-old hostess at the Disneyland theme park in Anaheim, California, back in 1974. She was a smart girl who was liked by everyone who met her. Unfortunately, her bright future would completely disappear that same night. Just before her shift, she called up her parents and exclaimed to them that she was in love and wanted their permission to get engaged. Obviously, her parents were very happy for her and allowed it. At around 10:30 p.m., when the last show got over and the stages were shifting position in between the 45-second interval, a guest from the adjacent theater heard a blood-chilling scream. When he and the operators rushed to the scene, they were horrified to see Debbie Stone crushed between the walls of the 2 theaters. To this day, no one knows what exactly went wrong. There have been numerous theories. Some state that Debbie may have been inclining towards the adjacent stage to talk to a fellow cast member, and she may have attempted to jump from one stage to another. Or she may have been distracted and stepped backwards without noticing. Whatever the reason, the fact remains that Debbie was crushed alive as the rotating wall closed against the stationary one. After the gruesome incident, Disneyland closed the ride for 2 days, and the stage on which Debbie died remained closed for a year. Later, the stages were installed with sensory lights to warn the operator if someone went too close to the walls, and additional changes were made by fixing breakaway walls in case the sensors failed. The ride remained open until 1988. Then it was shut down and the building remained obsolete until it was refurbished in 1998 for a new attraction called the Innoventions. Debbie Stone was known for her kindness and compassion, and the people whose lives she impacted were numerous, most prominent being a former classmate who claimed to have kicked his drug addiction because of her help. Over the years, her family received numerous letters from strangers and friends alike who expressed their support and gratitude for her.
SeaWorld employees alike realized a trainer was being attacked by a killer whale.
12,000-pound whale actually pulled her in.
Tilikum was involved in the deaths of 3 people throughout his life.
November 1983. Off the frigid waters of Iceland, the air is cold, but the tension is colder. A crew of fishermen locks in on a pod of orcas, with their nets and harpoons primed for the kill. Just as they're about to strike, the orcas sense the looming danger. The male orcas charge forward, trying to distract the boats, while the females frantically shepherd the calves away, but there's no way out. High above, a spotter plane with its pilot's eyes locked on the target makes a call, instructing the boats to swiftly change course and reach the calves. The nets close in, ensnaring the young orcas, including a 2-year-old calf that's dragged to the Hafnarfjordur Marine Zoo in Iceland's capital. The captors give it a name, Tilikum. Flashback 5 years before this brutal abduction to SeaWorld Orlando in Florida. 9-year-old Dawn Brancheau is on a trip of a lifetime. The youngest of 5 siblings, she's mesmerized by SeaWorld's Shamu show in 1978, watching in awe as the ocean's deadliest predator performs before a captivated crowd. That's when she told her parents she'd become a whale trainer one day and work at SeaWorld. But what no one in her family could have foreseen was how this childhood dream of hers would actually come true, leading her to cross paths with the abducted Tilikum in a way that would forever alter the world's view of killer whales in captivity. Dawn Brancheau, born Dawn Therese Laverde in Cedar Lake, Indiana, had her heart set on one thing after her visit to Orlando's SeaWorld, working with the orcas. Obsessed with the idea, she shaped her entire life around that passion. After earning degrees in psychology and animal behavior from the University of South Carolina, she didn't just stop at studying animals. Outside of work, she poured her time into volunteering at a local animal shelter, caring for 2 chocolate Labradors, and keeping a collection of stray ducks, chickens, rabbits, and small birds at her home. Following her professional journey, she started off working with dolphins at Six Flags Great Adventure in New Jersey for 2 years, but in 1994, her dreams led her to the gates of SeaWorld Orlando. At first, she was assigned to work with sea otters and sea lions, which wasn't exactly what she had envisioned, but the thrill of finally being at SeaWorld overshadowed any disappointment. She soaked up every moment of it. In 1996, she married a SeaWorld stunt water skier, Scott Brancheau, and that same year, her lifelong dream came to fruition. SeaWorld promoted her to work with the orcas. That's when she encountered Tilikum, or Tilly as they called him, who had been a resident of SeaWorld Orlando since 1992. But unlike the usual captive cetaceans, this one came with a history that hinted at something far more sinister beneath the surface. Going back to 1983, after being torn from his pod, Tilikum's bad days were only just beginning. Not long after, he was separated from 2 other orcas who were abducted alongside him. They were both sold off to a facility in Brazil, leaving the 2-year-old alone, isolated, and scared. He was shipped off to a marine park on Vancouver Island of Canada named Sealand of the Pacific. That flight from Iceland to Canada's west coast must have been a grueling, soul-crushing journey for such a young orca. Once at Sealand, things went from bad to worse. He was forced into confinement with 2 other older female orcas, Haida 2 and Nuka 5. Both these female orcas were from the Pacific Northwest, where Tilikum was from Iceland. And in orca society, every pod and area has their own unique signs and language, so from the very start, Tilikum struggled to communicate and fit in. Trapped and infuriated, Tilikum's nightmare escalated whenever he failed to meet the trainer's expectations. As punishment, all 3 orcas were denied food, creating tension between the 3 orcas. The 2 older females began harassing Tilikum, pushing him to his breaking point. Desperate to escape their brutality, Tilikum often sought refuge in a cramped back pool that was more like a crate, and was the only place where trainers could keep him safe. But the term safe was relative. This pool was a joke for a whale of any size. Even as a young orca, Tilikum was huge, and the tiny Sealand of the Pacific pools could never hold a single orca, let alone 3 at a time. Every moment spent in that confined space piled onto his agony. Then came the year 1991. After years of mounting frustration, Tilikum unleashed the first wave of the fury that had been festering inside him all along. On February 20th, a 20-year-old Canadian student and competitive swimmer, Kelty Lee Byrne, was working her shift at Sealand of the Pacific, handling the 3 orcas, when all of a sudden, she slipped and plunged into the whale pool. Before Byrne could regain her footing, the frustrated whale lunged at her, grabbing her by the foot and yanking her underwater. Panic set in fast, as the park's crew made several frantic attempts to free Byrne from Tilikum's powerful grip. But the whale wouldn't let go, even as she lost consciousness, with all 3 orcas adding to the chaos by circling and preventing any rescue attempts. When they finally pulled her out and separated the whales with a large net, it was already too late. She was declared dead. Up until that point, orcas were never known to fatally attack humans, so the authorities chalked up Burns' death to a tragic accident. But that was a fatal misjudgment. This wasn't just a freak accident. It was a calculated attack, and chillingly, it wouldn't be the last involving Tilikum. Fast forward almost 10 months to December 24th of 1991. One of the two Pacific Northwestern orcas, Haida 2, gave birth to a calf, fueling the already simmering tensions between Tilikum and the other two females. The new mother was fiercely protective, refusing to let Tilikum anywhere near the main pool. The moment he tried, they would chase him back to the back pool, confining him to the cramped space for 24 hours a day, week after week. Meanwhile, after Burns' death, Sealand's management decided to sell all of their orcas to SeaWorld and shut down the park for good, with Tilikum and Nuka being shipped to SeaWorld Orlando, while Haida and her calf were sold to SeaWorld San Antonio. Tilikum faced another grueling plane ride, this time from Canada's west coast, all the way down to the southeastern tip of the United States. At SeaWorld Orlando, Tilikum spent years confined in a tank that was again a far cry from the vast, open ocean he once swam in Iceland. To cover the distance he would have naturally swam in the wild each day, he would have had to circle SeaWorld's tiny tank over 1,900 times, which is a mind-numbing realization for a creature born to roam the open ocean. During his years at SeaWorld, Tilikum fathered 14 calves, and 4 years into this unnatural existence, in 1996, Tilikum met his new trainer, who was none other than Dawn Brancheau herself. Dawn and Tilikum quickly formed a bond, but captivity's toll on him grew more severe by the day. He was trained to perform in the Shamu show, but outside of those brief moments in the spotlight, he'd often lie motionless at the surface or bottom of the tank for long stretches every day, showing signs of severe stress and a lack of stimulation. Sometimes, in sheer frustration, he'd bite at the gates and concrete walls of the tank, damaging his own teeth in the process. And if that wasn't enough, he never felt at ease with the other orcas in his pool. There were times when they attacked him so viciously that he bled, trembled, and had to be kept out of the shows. On the night of July 6th, a 27-year-old homeless man from South Carolina named Daniel Dukes managed to hide inside the park after closing. He somehow climbed into Tilikum's pool, and what happened next still remains a mystery. When the staff returned the next morning, they discovered Dukes' mutilated body draped over Tilikum's back as the whale swam in circles. He was dead, but the most chilling part was that no one could say for sure what happened. Did Dukes accidentally drown, or did Tilikum drag him under? SeaWorld claims that there was no security footage of the pool that night to confirm. By this point, given the whale's disturbing history, it should have been crystal clear that Tilikum wasn't exactly living the high life in his concrete prison. Experts had warned the captors about the whale's stomach ulcers, which was an alarming sign of stress and inadequate stimulation, but the authorities kept on labeling the fatal attacks as mere accidents. Fast forward nearly 11 years after the second attack, and Tilikum was still stuck in the same grueling routine. The massive killer whale was paraded in shows, bred for calves, and tormented by space constraints and conflicts with other whales. However, despite the mounting stress, no major outbursts of aggression were recorded involving Tilikum, though on December 24th of 2009, another whale at SeaWorld killed trainer Alexis Martinez, but the management once again brushed it off as an accident, ignoring the troubling evidence. Eventually, the fateful day of February 24th of 2010 approached. Tilikum was set to perform at Dine with Shamu, where guests enjoyed a meal poolside while the orca entertained. Dawn Brancheau, Tilikum's favorite trainer, was set to perform with him. They'd shared countless shows before, and this wasn't a new gig for them, but this day held a dark twist. As the show rolled on, the crowd watched Tilikum and Dawn's performance. However, near the end of the performance, you could tell something was off. Tilikum wasn't following commands, and therefore wasn't getting rewarded with fish. At the end of the show routine, Dawn perched at the edge of the pool and was affectionately rubbing Tilikum's head, lying beside him on a slide-out. At this point, you could tell Tilikum was becoming extremely annoyed. The cheers and claps turned into terrifying screams. What the spectators in the arena witnessed was Tilikum yanking Dawn by her shoulder and dragging her into the water in the blink of an eye. The panic-stricken staff rushed in, desperately trying to pry the whale from the helpless trainer, but the relentless 12,000-pound killer whale dragged her down to the bottom until she was left unconscious. For the next 45 minutes, SeaWorld's training and rescue teams threw everything they had at separating Tilikum from Dawn's body, but the aggressive whale was unmoved. Eventually, they had to guide him into the medical pool, but this time with Dawn clutched in his grasp, who by now had already drowned. Once they finally managed to reach the whale, Dawn's mangled body was pulled from his jaws. The autopsy report revealed further disturbing details. Dawn's spinal cord had been severed, with her jawbone, ribs, and a cervical vertebra shattered. Her scalp had been violently torn from her head, and along her left arm and knee were dislocations. In the wake of this horrifying incident, SeaWorld Orlando banned trainers from entering the water with orcas. A prolonged legal battle followed, and on August 23rd of 2010, SeaWorld was slapped with safety violations and found to have willfully endangered its employees despite the clear warnings. Almost a year after Dawn's tragic death, Tilikum was back performing on March 30th of 2011 with rigorous safety measures. He continued in the show until he developed a bacterial infection and passed away on January 6th of 2017. In 2013, the American documentary Blackfish brought Tilikum and Dawn's story to light, casting a harsh spotlight on the captivity of orcas. SeaWorld, however, called the film misleading for obvious reasons. To this day, the tragic death of Dawn Brancheau was not her fault, nor the whales, rather the result of built-up anger after living in a bathtub for 33 years.
It's a theme park tragedy. It happened overnight. We mentioned this at the top of the show. At least 4 people were killed in Australia when a popular ride malfunctioned.
It's the end of October 2016. The weather in Queensland, Australia has started to turn, with the spring air warming up and the sun casting long, golden rays over the coastline. The air is filled with the excitement of families on holiday, each looking forward to the days of adventure and joy. A group from Canberra, including the 32-year-old mother Kate Goodchild, along with her husband Dave and their 2 daughters, a 12-year-old and an 8-month-old baby, are extending their trip after attending a family wedding. Kate, a public servant, has decided to treat her children to a fun day at the park. Accompanying them are Kate's brother, 35-year-old Luke Dorset, and his 38-year-old partner, Ruzba Aragi. The couple, known for their high-profile legal battle over stamp duty, are also public servants, working for the Department of Human Services. Meanwhile, 175 miles northeast of their hometown, in Sydney, Cindy Lowe and her family are on their own adventure. Originally from New Zealand, 42-year-old Cindy now lives in New South Wales capital with her husband Matthew and their 2 children, a 10-year-old son and a 6-year-old daughter. The family, along with some friends, are also headed to treat themselves with a relaxing day on the Gold Coast. While both of the groups have never seen each other before, soon they will cross paths at their mutual holiday destination, Australia's biggest and most breathtaking theme park, the Dreamworld. Dreamworld opened its doors in 1981 with a stellar cast of attractions. From concept to completion, the process had spanned 7 years, during which the owner even brought in some of the brains behind Disneyland and Walt Disney World to make the dream a reality. The park's inaugural lineup included an IMAX theater, a vintage car ride, the Rocky Hollow Log Ride, an Australia Koala Theater, and the Captain Sturt Paddle Wheeler. But that was just the beginning. Over the years that flew by, the park steadily expanded, adding roller coasters, a wildlife park, and several other rides that kept adding up to a grand total of 40, making it the largest theme park in Australia. Like other parks of its kind, Dreamworld developed sections with different themes. For example, the DreamWorks Experience Zone was a real hotbed of excitement, with spots themed around popular DreamWorks films like Kung Fu Panda and Madagascar. Similarly, the Ocean Parade Land captured the essence of Australian beach culture. Within these themes, 5 years down the line after its grand opening in 1986, Dreamworld rolled out a new themed area called the Town of Gold Rush Zone. This fresh addition brought 2 major rides, the Eureka Mountain Mine Ride and the Thunder River Rapids Ride. Both featured an extremely thrilling experience that continued to be the heart and soul of the park for a good 20 years until 2006, when Eureka Mountain Mine Ride was closed due to safety concerns. However, its counterpart, the Thunder River Rapids Ride, kept on chugging, and over the next decade, it only grew in popularity, drawing thousands and thousands of visitors every year. The park was raking in money, but just because things are going great doesn't mean they're bound to stay that way. Let's first start by breaking down how exactly the ride works. The basic design featured several circular rafts, each capable of carrying up to 6 riders, taking on a 410-meter or 1,350-foot long course. The whole thing was a wild ride with twisting and bumping channels, zipping through exhilarating maneuvers at speeds of up to 45 kilometers per hour or 28 miles per hour. In the beginning, riders would snake through a long indoor queue with tons of switchbacks. The queue even crossed over parts of the ride's water storage area before reaching the circular loading station. The station had a rotating platform, so you could hop on and off the rafts without having to stop them. Once you were on, the rafts would careen through the winding course, where riders would experience sudden drops and sharp turns, heightening the sense of excitement and unpredictability. The ride also featured a dark tunnel segment, adding a layer of suspense and thrill as riders plunged into the darkness, only to emerge into more twists and turns. Along the way, there were splash zones where water would spray up, soaking the riders and adding to the fun. The whole ride would last about 4 minutes, and was designed to keep the adrenaline racing with basically a new surprise at every turn. Now, unlike most rides of this kind, which were usually designed and built by Intamin, which was a big name in the ride design and manufacturing world, this one was a custom job by the park itself. The ride had a gentle downward slope, which was supposed to keep the water flowing and push the boats along without any onboard propulsion. This meant the circular boats were entirely at the mercy of the track and couldn't steer themselves, not even from the back end. So by the time the ride was over, those rafts had to be lifted up back to the station before they could go around again. Dreamworld pulled out all the stops and came up with a clever solution, doing this with a conveyor belt that almost worked like an elevator but for boats. This is where things could go south fast, and it was something that seemed pretty obvious but caught everyone off guard. The conveyor belt carried the boats up with guests still on board, and when the belt reached the top and the boats were back at the station, guests would disembark onto a rotating platform. Meanwhile, due to the downward gradient, just like the rafts needing to be pulled up at the end of the round, the water also had to be pumped up, which was typically accomplished by 2 large water pumps. On October 25th of 2016, during the normal operations of the ride, one of those water pumps stopped working, and with the ride's repetitive cycles, the water being pumped back onto the course started running low. But before anyone could catch on for a quick response, the ride kicked off another 4-minute course. That's when the 2 families ended up together. On the boarding platform, the Goodchilds took up 4 seats on one side of the circular rafts. This included Kate Goodchild, her 12-year-old, her brother Luke Dorset, and his partner. The remaining 2 seats were filled by Cindy Lowe and her 10-year-old son, while her husband and daughter were in another raft, since all 6 seats on this raft were occupied. As the ride went on, everyone was having a blast, not realizing the water level back up on the boarding platform was dropping dangerously low. Unbeknownst to the fact, folks continued to have a ball and eventually reached the juncture where boats had to board the conveyor belt to be lifted back to the platform, which now had fallen short of water, so much so that the boats couldn't move forward. Being at the front of the line, Cindy and Goodchild's boat was the first to board the conveyor belt and start its slow ascent. But just as it was nearing the end of the belt, where it was supposed to be dispatched to the boarding platform, a forsaken empty raft, perhaps from a previous cycle, lay obstructed on the support rails, jammed due to the insufficient water level. And since it was just short of the platform, it remained unforeseen by those above. The conveyor belt, on the other hand, kept moving, carrying Cindy's raft higher and higher until they all came to a harrowing realization that they were on a collision course with the stranded raft. But before they could react, the collision struck with deadly force. The impact sent both rafts reeling on the support rails. The empty raft was thrust back into its original horizontal position, while the belt's relentless movement forced the occupied raft into a horrifying vertical stance. 4 of the adults were instantly thrown off the ride with their bodies flung onto the conveyor belt, while the kids somehow managed to cling to the raft. The fate of the adults was grim and brutal. Some were dragged beneath the stranded rafts, their bodies crushed under the weight of the wreckage, while others plummeted through the gaping holes in the conveyor belt, their screams echoing in the dark void as their bodies were twisted in the intricate gears of the machinery below. Following the collision, viewers rushed in, raising the roof and crying out for assistance. Thankfully, the staff jumped into action and put the brakes on the conveyor, otherwise it could have been way worse. Still, the loss was beyond words. When the machine finally came to a halt, the 2 kids who were clinging to the boat, watching their parents get crushed and torn apart by the moving belt, were rescued. The ride was evacuated, and the park shut down as a recovery operation kicked into gear. Even after draining all the water from the ride, it took until the next morning to retrieve the bodies. The process was so horrific that even some of the paramedics needed counseling afterwards. The 2 kids who made it out physically unharmed were also sent for professional help because of the severe trauma they witnessed. In the aftermath of the incident, multiple investigation reports highlighted a laundry list of failures on the park's end. There was no automatic water level indicator, and they hadn't done a proper risk assessment, leaving it up to the ride's staff, none of whom were trained engineers. The maintenance staff was completely in the dark about the location of the emergency stop button in the main control room, and had never put it to the test. Not only that, even basic safety features that would have cost next to nothing weren't in place. The entire ride was deemed completely unsafe, and worst of all, it was revealed that the ride had experienced multiple issues in the days leading up to the accident, and officials not only turned a blind eye to them, but also kept the ride running at maximum capacity. On July 21st of 2020, Dreamworld's parent company, Ardent Leisure, was slapped with 3 charges under the Work Health and Safety Act. They didn't fight it and ended up pleading guilty, which led to a hefty $3.6 million fine and a $2.1 million settlement to the victims' families. The Thunder River Rapids ride, where the tragedy occurred, was demolished in 2018. By 2019, Dreamworld had announced the steel Type roller coaster would take its place. Although Ardent Leisure shelled out over $5 million in compensation, along with a memorial garden that was set up near where the ride once stood, no amount of money could ever turn back the clock on the loss of those priceless lives. On June 7th of 2016, psychology graduate Colin Scott and his sister Sable were traveling through a prohibited area of Yellowstone National Park with the intent to partake in hot potting within one of Yellowstone's thermal pools, a day that ended in tragedy. Colin Scott had recently graduated from Pacific University and traveled from Portland, Oregon to meet his sister. The pair decided to take a day trip to Yellowstone National Park, stopping not far from the Norris Geyser Basin. With nobody traveling alongside them, the Scotts opted to deviate from the prescribed route that covered thermal areas within the basin. This is an act prohibited within the park due to the dangerous nature of hot springs at Yellowstone. According to the National Park Service, it's crucial for visitors to stay on the boardwalks, as the heat and acidity of hot springs makes them the biggest natural cause of death or injury within Yellowstone. According to park officials, at least 22 people have died from hot spring accidents at Yellowstone since 1890. However, not only did they ignore the warnings placed throughout the walk, walking several hundred feet up a hill in the process, they also had planned to engage in hot potting. Hot potting is the prohibited exercise of swimming in hot springs. Sable filmed herself and her brother deviating from the boardwalk path when they came across one of the hot pools. Colin kneeled down to examine the temperature of the spring when he suddenly slipped and fell into it. Under normal circumstances, water temperatures at Norris Geyser reach around 93 degrees Celsius or 199 degrees Fahrenheit. With his sister unable to rescue him, and herself also suffering minor injuries in the process, Colin died from scalding as a result of the submersion within the thermal hot spring. He was only 23 years old. Sable was unable to call for immediate assistance as there was no mobile phone service at the basin, meaning Sable was forced to retreat and leave her brother to go to the nearby Ranger Museum for assistance. When the officials reached the spring, they found the remains of Scott's head, upper torso, and hands. However, they were unable to recover these remains because the spring was now at 100 degrees Celsius or 212 degrees Fahrenheit, with a lightning storm also being forecasted. The next morning, officials returned to the spring, but by that point the acidic pool had completely dissolved Scott's body. All that remained were a few personal belongings, including his wallet and flip-flops. Colin Scott had graduated from Pacific University a few weeks prior and was a top student, a wonderful person, and a testament to all the values that Pacific University stands for.